Hello, everyone. I'm happy to introduce today's event. My name is Ludmila Kozlovska. I represent Open Dialogue Foundation. Together with our partners, we have a number of key speakers from different countries, which will discuss today effectiveness and importance of personal sanctions. And I immediately to give the floor to introduce our event to Antonio Stango, President of Italian Federation for Human Rights. Antonio, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ludmila, and thank you to everybody. So the event of today, we as Italian Federation for Human Rights are organizing together with the Open Dialogue Foundation, the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, the Freedom Kazakhstan Foundation, and the Global Committee for the Rule of Law. We are several organizations headquartered in different countries with some common goal. And one of the main goals in this period is to help the international community, the democratic states especially, to sanction in an efficient way those who are individually responsible of serious violations of human rights and possibly also of gross corruption. This is the purpose of the Global Magnitsky Act that was approved already almost 10 years ago for the first time in the United States, and several similar legislations have been then approved in other countries, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, for what concerns the European Union member states, and the discussions are going to the point in Australia and in Norway. But in December 2020, after several months of consultation among the member states of the European Union, the Council of the European Union adopted the European Union Global Human Rights Sanctions regime. So it is something new. It is something that we and the other organizations that are today at this event have been working in the past. Because we always had the idea that it is very important that a single state have this kind of mechanism, this important tool to sanction human rights perpetrators, but it will be also very good if the European Union as a whole will have a similar mechanism. So this happened. Of course, I would say that this mechanism is not perfect. For instance, it is missing this possibility to sanction also for gross acts of corruption or grand corruption, but still it is a tool that the European Union itself can start using. And this is happening. Already some persons have been sanctioned under this new EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime. And we do hope that this mechanism will be used more and more in the proper way. Certainly, this doesn't come so easy from a political point of view, and it leaves room also for initiatives of the counterpart, let's say, and also as we have been discussing in some of the events that we did in the last few years, it is always necessary also to provide the persons that are targeted by these sanctions with the possibility to do some appeal. And so it is a delicate mechanism, but still, as I said, a very important one. So something new that some states is using and has been using already several years in a very strong way, especially the United States of America, and we believe that we can do more. This is why we are working today with several experts as well as with members of parliament. Today we will have among us our friends, the member of Italian Senate, Roberto Rampi, who among his merits is also the one to have been the person that initiated in the Italian parliament a bill. He introduced a bill for the adoption also in Italy of Magnitsky type sanctions. And he is also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So one thing that we want to do, and I'm going already to the conclusion in order to leave everybody the possibility to do some report also about their activities and to introduce their ideas on this issue. One thing that we want to do is to involve more and more also the international institutions and the international parliamentary assembly. For instance, the one of the OSCE, although it's very difficult there, because we know that within the OSCE there are also represented several states who do not respect human rights. But anyway, we are working also there. We are working at the EU level institutions, and we will try to do more also at a wider level. Let's think, for instance, at the UN. All of this is difficult, we know, but we count on the fact that I would say more and more parliaments are discussing this, and more experts like people that we have today in our debate are working to this. So thank you very much for the moment.
Sorry. Thank you so much, all partners, and Antonio for introduction. So now I would like to give the floor and also to show a presentation of Eskander Bariyev, the head of the board of Crimean Tatar Resource Center and the head of the Department of Legal and Foreign Affairs of Majlis in Crimean Tatar people. So I'm a little bit switching on some of our panelists, so we will have more possibility to show presentation. And now I'm going a little bit to do it. Just a moment. Okay. So, and we are going to show presentation. And Antonio, Eskander, if you can also, while I'm trying to join our presentation, if you can please also comment or prepare to be commented with. We know that you work extensively for promoting personal sanctions on Russian senior officials who were significantly, systematically engaged in political persecution, assassinations, and for the occupation of Crimea and eastern part of Ukraine. And can you please share with us your observation? Why do you think they set sanctions on 95 individual Russian decision makers and 23 entities responsible for destabilization of the eastern Ukraine and illegal annexation of Crimea didn't stop widespread repression in Crimea and the occupied territories? Who should be subject to personal sanction next, when and why, in the context of Russia's aggression in Ukraine and recently adopted sanctions leased on key Russian officials by the US and Canada and other states? In just a moment, I'm trying to show your presentation. Okay.
While you're trying to show your presentation, I would like to thank Ludmila and to greet everyone. Of course, when we speak about violation of human rights, we can't not to mention the current situation and how sanctions work with regard to violators of human rights. I would like to emphasize that only for the first quarter of 2021, Russia had 11 military exercises on the territory of the peninsula with the participation of more than 3,800 military personnel and more than 600 units of military and special equipment. Since March 2021, Russia has been escalating the conflict by transferring 2 armies and 3 airborne units to the borders of Ukraine. Russia plans to deploy 110,000 servicemen and 20,000 units of military equipment, including strategic aviation. There is a record number of Russian forces concentrated near the borders of Ukraine for the last years. Tension is also growing at sea, as 15 ships of the Caspian flotilla have been sent to the Black Sea. A number of ships of this fleet are equipped with the Caliber launch complex for launching cruise missiles. Russia's genocide policy, the Crimean Tatar people returned into a minority in their homeland. The population of Crimea is being replaced. The Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians are intimidated through repressions and are purposefully forced out of the Crimea as a population disloyal to Russia. More than 500,000 Russians were brought from Russia to Crimea, and about 50,000 Ukrainian citizens were forced to leave it. In Crimea, people are forced to obtain Russian passports, and those who refuse are deprived of their property rights or deported from Crimea. The analysis of human rights violations in Crimea in 2020 reveals the following trends, as seen on the slide. They include searches on the grounds of negative misprision, detention of activists who come to support political prisoners at the so-called court sessions, the persecution of entire families, as well as wives and mothers of political prisoners, strengthenings of Russian legislation and its application in the persecution of Ukrainian citizens, long-term imprisonment for political prisoners of the Crimea, massive cases of non-provision of proper medical care and deterioration of the health of political prisoners in Crimea, in pretrial detention centers and prisons, as well as cases of moral pressure and physical violence against detained activists and political prisoners. 2020 saw a record number of arrests, detentions, violations of civil liberties and human rights. The next slide, please. At the moment, in accordance with the classification of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center, there are 230 political prisoners and prosecuted in criminal cases for the whole occupation period of Crimea, including 158 Crimean Tatar people, 59 convicted who served sentence in a colony on the territory of Russia, including 36 Crimean Tatars. 60 persons are in temporary detention centers, include 44 Crimean Tatars. 31 persons are restricted in the activities or on probation period, including 20 Crimean Tatars. 32 persons persecuted, including 26 Crimean Tatars. 55 persons are killed during the occupation of Crimea, including 25 Crimean Tatars. 21 victims of violent abductions during the occupation of Crimea, including 15 representatives of the Crimean Tatar people. In violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, people are massively conscripted into the Russian armed forces. Those who refuse are subject to criminal proceedings. The actions of the Russian Federation are criminal, politically motivated, and grossly violate international law. Sanctions, of course, are the most important tool to contain the aggression of the Russian Federation and the ongoing repression. Currently, the EU has imposed sanctions on 95 people and 23 legal entities, and the consolidated list of UK financial sanctions include 180 people and 48 legal entities. Until now, EU sanctions against Crimea have been applied only against persons involved in the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and not against those involved in human rights violations in the occupied peninsula. I would like to note that the lists do not include judges, investigators, prosecutors, FSB officers, and representatives of law enforcement agencies who are directly related to the violation of human rights in Crimea. Therefore, these lists can be considered incomplete both qualitatively and quantitatively, and those who directly commit human rights violations go unpunished. At present, the Crimean Tatar Resource Center has prepared a list of 150 people violating human rights. I want to give an example of 3 persons on the list. You can see them on the slide. Abdullayev Vadim Valerievich, head of the investigative authority, head of the investigation department of the FSB of Russia for the Republic of Kazakhstan and Sevastopol, Colonel Borden Artyom Alexeyevich, senior investigator for particularly important cases of the investigative department of the FSB of Russia, Major of Justice Volkov, military prosecutor of the Department of the Military Prosecutor's Office of the Southern Military District, Major of Justice. On December 7, 2020, the European Parliament approved a resolution on Ukraine's implementation of the Association Agreement and called on the European External Action Service to promptly put in place the EU Global Human Rights Sanctions regime. The European Parliament invited Ukraine to follow this example and present its Ukrainian version. The Crimean Tatar Resource Center is systematically working towards the adaptation of analogs laws to the Magnitsky Act in order to introduce personal sanctions against those responsible for human rights violations in Crimea, a methodology for assessing the feasibility of introducing personal sanctions against persons in the temporarily occupied territories who cooperate with the occupational administrations of the Russian Federation has been developed. This methodology can be applied in Ukrainian legislation and contribute to the universal sanction lists for international partners. We are confident that only with active joint opposition to gross violations of human rights in Crimea, we will be able to protect not only the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars and Ukraine, but also Europe and the whole world. Thank you for your attention.
So much, Eskander. And now I would like to give the floor to Franak Vechorka. Franak, are you with us? Franak? Okay, perfect. You are with us, and I'm just adding you to the stream and change a little bit our... Yeah, perfect. So, happy to see you. And happy to share with you. Possibly just a moment. It's better. So, Franek is a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and a journalist, famous journalist from Belarus. And I would like to ask you if it's possible. European Union has officially expressed support for the new international platform to document human rights violation by the regime of Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. And its name, International Accountability Platform for Belarus. At the same time, EU has not yet imposed personal sanctions on Belarusian officials under the new EU regime, sanctions regime. Are you aware of the reason for the delay and how strongly it affects civil society and those who fight for freedom in Belarus? And any progress in inclusion of perpetrators of already documented human rights violation by Lukashenko regimes? What are your recommendations? Could you share, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lyudmila, and thank you for having Belarus on the agenda. I just listened to Crimean story, and unfortunately, I must say that Belarus, in general, is transforming into occupied Crimea, and we see very similar problems, very similar facts of human rights violations, and facts of torture revealed every day. You are right that there is an international accountability platform launched by 15 European states. Primarily, it was initiated by Denmark, UK, and Germany, and then other EU states supported. And the idea of the platform is to help Belarus human rights defenders to collect evidence of torture, human rights violation, which must be done in Belarus by Belarus activists. Unfortunately, after the platform was announced, the volunteers collecting evidences, they got persecuted and they got tortured. And that's horrible, but that also shows that conventional approaches and conventional methods do not work in Belarus. So on one hand, we have to collect evidences. On the other hand, all those who collect evidences face extreme pressure, unbelievable crackdown. There is another instrument which is supposed to strengthen the international platform, accountability platform, was initiated by UN Human Rights Council. In their latest resolution 1 month ago, HRC voted for giving special mandate to High Commissioner on human rights to not just to collect evidence, but also to initiate proceedings to take people to bring the perpetrators to justice. And this is quite new thing for Belarus, and I think this is huge success, and it gives us the chance that there will not be impunity. Then that all those heroes of human rights violations and crackdowns, they will appear in international courts, or at least in national courts under universal jurisdiction. Unfortunately, all these procedures, they need time. All this accountability mechanism, they're very slow, very bureaucratic. I think all panelists and participants of this event, they know very well that it's very difficult to get immediate results. It's more the work for the future. And here, sanctions must be helpful. Sanctions are much quicker accountability mechanism than international tribunal in Hague, which can take place in 5 or 10 years. And unfortunately, sanctions in case of Belarus are not adopted in the scale they must be adopted. And you asked, Ludmila, what is the reason? I think that the problem is, on one hand, it's the lack of political will. And on the second hand, on another hand, it's a lack of media or extreme dependency on media attention. Because the political will appears when this information is on the media. But media are very quickly getting tired of the same news about Crimea, about Belarus, about Azerbaijan or Armenia, about anything. And here is the big challenge: how to force stakeholders or European Union officials who decide on sanctions to act quickly. And I don't have answer here. I see that U.S. sanctions and U.S. decisions are much faster here. We just read that the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia, which I think is incredible speed for international actors in terms of reaction. But this is the unique case. When we speak about smaller nations, smaller problems, unfortunately, both EU and US are quite slow. And I don't have solution here. I just encourage other panelists to discuss it.
Yeah, of course, but maybe actually this joint discussion, joint cooperation in this regard, when all forces of civil society from different countries are gathered together, would be able to have impact also on EU officials or on other states, because it's not only the first problem when sometimes we hear from top officials, from EU officials, that sanctions should be the last tool in the relationship. No, actually, it should be preventive when you don't wait, when it's escalate too much. And thank you so much for your presentation. And I would like immediately to give the floor to Barlik, because we also have the same situation in Kazakhstan. Barlik, if you can also share your views, because I mean, we heard some similar, the same like Franek said, just that fortunately, sometimes not only EU but also US, extremely slow in decision making, for example, when it comes about sanctions. So can you please share the current situation and how it evaluates current situation with human rights in Kazakhstan, and how it's evaluated with the process of lobbying personal sanctions because of huge deterioration with human rights in Kazakhstan?
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak about the human rights abuses in Kazakhstan. As you know, guys, on February 11, the European Parliament adopted an urgent resolution of human rights situation in Kazakhstan. One of the resolution recommendations was to consider imposing personal sanction of those responsible for mass human rights violations. A key justification for EU sanction against Kazakh regime comes from the mass persecution of peaceful protesters and torture. Over 8,500 people have been politically persecuted on their participation in peaceful opposition movements and peaceful protests in the last 4 years. This repression still escalating today, peaked December 2011. At the time, peaceful protesters in Janauzen were shot by police in Kazakhstan. hundreds were tortured, and some of them were disappeared. Dozens were sentenced to political prison terms. All those who gave the order to shoot on the torture remained unpunished, and they continued repression in Kazakhstan even today. Currently, in Kazakhstan, we have 5 political murders, 27 political prisoners, and 28 convicted for political reasons, with a ban on public and human rights activities. There are 3 women political prisoners: Nurgul Kaulova, Asel Olagbek-kızı, Diana Baymagambetova. Each of them face up of 17 years in prison. Can you believe it? All they are guilty for collecting humanitarian aid for political prisoners and for demanding sanctions for human rights violations. Most political prisoners are persecuted for the demand to impose personal sanction for human rights violators in Kazakhstan. For the same reason, 103 persons are under criminal prosecution and 12 under house arrest. This is why we are extremely worried when some diplomats, and especially Ambassador in Kazakhstan, Peter Buryan, says that it's too early to impose sanctions against officials in Kazakhstan. We do not want to wait for another mass shooting and the victims of political killings. The people of Kazakhstan remember Janauzen mass shooting and torture victims of Nazarbayev regime well. We bore to top 5 human rights activists in Kazakhstan in 2020. I would like to remind all of you that there is not a single example in the world practice that dictatorial regime itself refused from repression and violence against their own people. And that's why it's called dictatorship. Activists of civil society are only holding back Chinese expansion. They're only ones who are fighting for democracy in Kazakhstan. I don't want to wage genocide against our nation or compare Kazakhstan to North Korea. On the contrary, we want to avoid becoming the second North Korea. As the people of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, we favor proactive personal sanctions. Sanctions are a very important preventive tool before mass tragedies happen. Thank you so much for attention.
Thank you, Barlik. And now I immediately switch on Bota. Bota, you're with us. Can you please turn on your microphone? So, Bota, lawyer and human rights defender, sister of former Kazakhstani political prisoners. Barlik helped us to understand the current human rights situation in Kazakhstan. But he pointed out that the same people responsible for shooting in Janauzen, political murders, torture, and mass persecution of peaceful protesters enjoy impunity. Who and why should be sanctioned to personal sanctions, and to what extent we can say that its personal sanctions are effective in case of Kazakhstan? Because there are different, let's say, opinion who say that it's not always effective, the way I don't have a much impact. Could you show maybe other countries as an example where personal sanctions have contributed to real reforms or help to end impunity for perpetrators? And I know that you should run your film first, so I'm now going to show you.
Luda, say hi to everyone, right?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today. And as Luda mentioned, I need to run a little video to illustrate the point I'd like to make today. Luda, can you?
Okay. Yes. some problems?
I don't know, I guess it was frozen, but you got the idea, right? And obviously, I'm not advertising any luxury real estate here. These properties that I demonstrated, their properties in various Western countries have one thing in common. They belong to the family members of Nursultan Nazarbayev, former president of Kazakhstan. And this is only a fraction of what they actually own outside of Kazakhstan. And in Kazakhstan, they own the country. Nazarbayev has built a corrupt, kleptocratic, and authoritarian regime. We have good news. Nazarbayev is no longer head of state, but there is bad news. In the existing system, Nazarbayev, together with his relatives and his trusted associates, has consolidated all economic and political powers. Even after his resignation, he de facto retains the ultimate powers. And Nazarbayev's nominal successor that you see on the screen, current head of state, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, is continuing Nazarbayev's policy, making Nazarbayev's regime even stronger with increased political persecution, as Baruch just described to us. And Tokayev is not regarded as an independent political figure in Kazakhstan. So now we have a system, a power system, in which dictator enjoys full impunity, enjoys all these properties all over the world, and is hidden behind a nominal head of state. And reportedly, Putin has considered adopting something similar. So Nazarbayev and his inner circle are the ultimate beneficiary of all corruption and systemic human rights violations in Kazakhstan. And of course, they are ready to do whatever it takes to stay in power. We see now with Belarus the example how much it takes to remove a dictator from his comfortable position. In the latest resolution on Kazakhstan that Baruch mentioned, the European Parliament called on the EU to consider introduction of targeted sanctions. And we repeated again and again, yes, EU, please consider. Nazarbayev and his key associates, such as the head of political police, Karim Masimov, the general prosecutor, Gizat Nurdauletov, and the Minister of Internal Affairs, Irvan Turgebayev, should be EU targets. Obviously, we have a longer list, but these are key human rights violators in the country who enjoyed grand corruption as well. And I have to mention that the regime in Kazakhstan is relatively sensitive when it comes to the criticism by the West about the lack of democracy and human rights violation. And this sensitivity comes from Nazarbayev's and his associates' fear of Western sanctions. And why they fear, you see on the screen. They keep their assets and funds in the West. As many other kleptocrats from other countries, we know many examples, and obviously they don't want to lose what they have stolen. They don't want to keep their money and assets in authoritarian China or Russia. They want to enjoy everything what Europe has to offer, and they don't trust Chinese or Russian financial and political systems. They know where to hide their money. But at the same time, we have to admit that despite this fear of sanctions, the existing regime in Kazakhstan has not made any significant steps in order to achieve the rule of law. Instead, in dealing with the West, Nazarbayev regime continues to rely on propaganda in which, superficial improvements are advertised as major reforms, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, heavy lobbying, and even weaponized corruption. Why they do that? Because they can. Because there haven't been any personal consequences for human rights violators from Kazakhstan. The Kazakh regime thinks that EU diplomats are gullible and naive, since they believe empty promises and false claims of Kazakhstan state officials. And EU diplomats talk about values, but ignore them when it comes to trade and investment from Kazakhstan. And it's been over 20 years of failed reforms and empty promises. And the situation, as Baruch just described, is just getting worse. And just as Belarus, we need a quick accountability mechanism, as Franak mentioned already. So it's time to make it clear to the authorities of Kazakhstan that they should stop pretending that they engage in dialogue and they must deliver. And if the EU imposes smart targeted sanctions on the key human rights perpetrators, it will punish the worst human rights abusers, bring some justice to the victim, create a serious incentive for the regime to actually comply with the country's international obligations on human rights. And at the same time, it will help to combat the inflow of illegal funds into the EU countries. And I would like to finish with an example. Last year, EU sanctioned an oligarch from Moldova, Vladimir Plakhatnyuk. Many of you know of him. He was the one who controlled all branches of power in the country, although he formally didn't hold any position in the country. He was sanctioned because his corrupt actions undermined the rule of law and severely compromised the independence of democratic institutions in Moldova. You see the tweet of Pompeo on the screen. And after Plakhatnyuk had been sanctioned, Moldova had presidential elections where an opposition candidate, Maya Sandu, could run, and she actually won. And Kazakhstan has never had free and fair election. So I am asking the EU, give our society a chance to succeed, impose sanctions on Nazarbayev and his cronies. We need a fast accountability mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bota. Just a moment. I hear somewhere myself. And now it's fine. No, I hear all the time. Just maybe I try to delete all not necessary stuff. Just a moment. Okay, now it's fine. Okay, so I would like to give the floor to our very important key speaker, because it's geographically even, and one of the most, I would say, difficult case. It's case of China, Hong Kong, and Joe Siu, Hong Kong Watch Associate. Please share with us also your observations and your concerns, because I think what is the main achievement of civil society of Hong Kong and citizens of Hong Kong and many Chinese dissidents who fight for freedom and human rights, that you had at all chance to put someone on sanctions from China. But at the same time, China is not easy state. It's also respond. It puts someone, a lot of EU, US, and other foreign politicians and so-called response sanctions. And as Bota also said, there is really huge importance to have urgent mechanism, also Franek said, and our speakers, to stop this feeling of impunity, and especially support those who try to boost reforms, who try to have real election. And I think in case of Hong Kong, it's extremely important. And I know that there is also initiative on, for example, members of European Parliament to support Hong Kongers in order to put into personal sanctions and EU regime those who are responsible for basically violation of international law on election and mass persecution in Hong Kong. What do you think, how you perceive this mechanism of EU personal sanctions regime, how it can be effective, when it should be applied, and why?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And it is really a pleasure for me to be here and then to bring you the updates on Hong Kong's latest developments, and also to have this very important discussion with the other stakeholders who have been involved in advocating for the implementation of Magnitsky-style sanctions all across the globe to hold all these human rights abusers accountable. And perhaps I will start by really introducing to you the situations in Hong Kong.
Yep. Please.
So the pro-democracy struggle in Hong Kong broke out in 2019. And then throughout actually the whole struggle in Hong Kong, we have seen a very serious level of police brutality going on in Hong Kong almost on a daily basis, where we see lethal weapons deployed unreasonably by the police force during every demonstration and protest in Hong Kong. And then we have also witnessed the kind of like targeted attacks and also assaults on not only protesters in Hong Kong, but then also against journalists, first aid responders, and also social workers in Hong Kong, who are not even the participants of protests, but then really there to calm down the situation in Hong Kong. So we have witnessed the kind of very serious police brutality, and then alongside the kind of like political suppression from the Hong Kong government going on in Hong Kong ever since 2019. And very soon, seeing the ongoing disobedience from the people of Hong Kong, the Beijing government decided to implement this national security legislation in Hong Kong in July 2020. And then with the 4 very important elements in the legislation, which are subversion, secession, terrorism, and also collusion with foreign forces, the Hong Kong government and also the National Security Department of Hong Kong have already made a lot of arrests in Hong Kong, including the arrest of everyday protesters who were only displaying banners related to that have been printed with protest-related slogans. We have also seen the arrest of legal professionals, scholars, foreign nationals, and also media company owners like Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. And aside from all these people, we are also witnessing the very unprecedented massive arrest of the 47 prominent pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong. And currently, they're all being put into jail and then charged with the name of subversion. And they're not only facing a potential imprisonment of up to 10 years to lifetime, but then also the possibility of being extradited to mainland China, and then to stand the very corrupted judicial system in mainland China. And that is one of the most concerning developments in Hong Kong recently. And actually, aside from all of these arrests made by the National Security Department in Hong Kong by the Beijing, with the orders from the Beijing government, we are also witnessing the other kind of suppressions. For example, the electoral change in Hong Kong. So several weeks ago, the Chinese National People's Congress, the rubber stamp parliament in Beijing, fueled by pro-Beijing loyalists, have passed a resolution to overhaul Hong Kong's electoral system, basically banning all these pro-democracy voices, banning all these pro-democracy candidates from participating in elections or to hold public offices in the future. So this is really a continuous crackdown on the possibility of pro-democracy leaders to participate in institutionalized elections in Hong Kong. And we are seeing that going on in Hong Kong. And meanwhile, this is also the first time ever since 1997 that the term one country, two system was not even mentioned in the Chinese department, that is not even mentioned in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference Chairman's annual report. And also description regarding Hong Kong also changed from Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong to patriots ruling Hong Kong. So we see this as a very important signal given by Beijing, signaling that the so-called high degree of autonomy, the so-called one country, two system framework in Hong Kong is over right now. And actually during the period of hangover, the Chinese government made several promises saying that they will be respecting the people of Hong Kong, they will be respecting the values of people in Hong Kong. And for these promises made not only to the people of Hong Kong, to the British government, but then also to the international community, the Chinese government promised that they will be respecting all these core values of Hong Kong. They will be respecting the freedoms and also rights that the people of Hong Kong are supposed to be enjoying. But then apparently with the developments and also with the continuous encroachment over the years after 1997, after the handover happened, it is very apparent and very obvious that none of these promises made by the Chinese government in 1997 has been fulfilled. But then in contrast, the people of Hong Kong were deprived from exercising our very, very fundamental rights and also freedoms of, for example, participating in assemblies, for example, simply expressing our political views, or simply to participate in elections in Hong Kong. And what the Chinese Communist Party have been doing is not only of a violation of human rights in Hong Kong, but then also in the other regions. For example, the ongoing forced sterilization, the organized sexual harassment, the forced labor are still happening in the so-called re-education camps in the East Turkestan region. We're still seeing Uyghurs in exile cannot escape from the long arms from the Chinese Communist Party. They receive threatening messages very, very frequently or almost on a daily basis. And they are still living in fears, even though they are not in China, that they are still living in the fear that they might be kidnapped and then sent back to China to spend their judicial system, or that they will be put into detention camps alongside their other friends and also family members. So I would say with existing Magnitsky-style sanctions or legislations in place, exercising such mechanisms or imposing targeted sanctions on Chinese officials or Hong Kong officials is going to be one of the most effective and also be one of the quickest way to hold these officials who have been involved in committing human rights violations responsible. And this would be one of the most effective and quickest ways. However, we are also facing a lot of challenges. So for currently, we're seeing sanctions imposed by the United States, by UK, and also very encouragingly by the European Union on targeted Chinese officials for committing genocide in the East Turkestan region. We have seen the Magnitsky-style sanctions imposed against officials in mainland China, Hong Kong, and also which have been working for the Xinjiang autonomous region departments. And most of them have been targeted on these individuals who have been directly involved in the decision-making process of these human rights violations. However, as I have mentioned, that countries are also facing a lot of challenges and also a lot of obstacles when they are planning to impose such kind of like sanctions against Chinese officials, because that we understand that China is one of the greatest superpowers nowadays, and with so much wealth and also resources, it is going to be hard for countries that are planning to stand up against the human rights violations that were committed by the Chinese Communist Party, because we understand how great the political and also economic sacrifices that could be for imposing sanctions on these targeted officials. So I felt like it is really crucial and also very important for us, especially for the countries with better economic ability or political power, to take the lead in forming alliances and to encourage countries to take joint and coordinated actions together, not only in terms of imposing targeted coordinated sanctions against Chinese officials, but then also to come up with plans of like being each other's backbones, because we have witnessed how China is taking actions to impose counter sanctions. For example, a few days ago, we see that the Chinese government announced the sanctions against targeted UK parliamentarians and also against the other targeted parliamentarians or governmental officials in the United States. And we have also seen from a lot of previous examples and also experiences that China will be putting a very tremendous political pressure or be imposing economic restrictions against countries that are willing to stand up against the human rights violations committed by the Chinese Communist Party. For example, we have seen the unreasonable economic tariffs imposed on Australia. We have seen the kind of like economic restrictions and pressures imposed on Norway simply because that they hosted the Nobel Prize ceremony and the award was being awarded to one of the most prominent human rights defenders from mainland China, Liu Xiaobo. So I felt like it is really crucial for countries like the United States, the UK, or the EU as a whole to take the lead to form alliances and to take coordinated actions together and to be each other's backbone to support countries that are going to suffer from China's counter-economic sanctions. And also, as the other speakers have mentioned, that it is going to take a long time for countries to evaluate, to review, to coordinate, and to impose sanctions on targeted individuals. And it is also going to take time for these sanctions to actually start taking effect. So, and also it would be practically impossible for us to sanction every individual or to sanction every entities that have been involved in human rights violations committed by, for example, for example, by Russia or by China. So with all these limitations, on top of imposing sanctions, it would also be very crucial for us to really think about and to reflect on our current strategies when it comes to dealing with China or Russia, on what kind of proactive measures that can be taken by us to prevent all these human rights violations from actually happening, so that we can no longer only rely on the existing mechanisms of imposing sanctions or rely on the existing mechanisms that are related to imposing Magnitsky-style sanctions. So that is all that I wanted to share today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now I want to give the floor to one of a member of Italian Parliament, member of Special Committee on Human Rights in Italian Senate and the Italian delegation in Parliament Assembly of Council of Europe, Roberto Rampi. Roberto, you heard, I mean, kind of the most important speeches, right, from different countries, and now a little bit moving to what to do, what international organization can do, what parliamentarians can do. And I know that you was one of initiator of actually Italian version of Global Magnitsky Act, and one of the most important question from all civil society representatives, one of our viewers now, how human rights defenders voices can be amplified in those authoritarian states which basically silent and increasing repression to those who call on international level to impose personal sanctions. How members of different national parliaments of EU can support them. Please share your views, your plans, some kind of insights to our viewers. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much, Ludmila, for all your work and for this kind of day that is very important, because I believe part of the answer is exactly in events like that one, because we today have together different kind of human rights defender and also human rights victims, so people from very different countries in which one there is a very big problem of human rights, and different ONG and different organizations of civil society that are working together. And if you think about our first meeting, Chamber of Deputies, some years ago, but not so many years ago, or also when we decided to try to translate in Italian, so in the European, not British language, in the Magnitsky Act sanction, we do a lot of work, really. We had very important changement. That idea that the European Union is using some kind of sanction like Magnitsky, that was not possible, and not even something that we can imagine when we started work. That kind of work of many organizations and many different human rights defenders in so different countries. So I believe the most important thing is to have a real global action, transnational action with different kind of people, because we have to let people understand that human rights is not a problem of one or two countries, and it's not a specific problem of that country that maybe some politician wants to stress because of his ideological point of view, because of his believing. Human rights is something that we build all together. So no one can teach human rights to anyone other. Sanction is something very important, but it's the last part of the work of promoting human rights. The most important is making a very important connection with people, with civil society, with politicians, with members of parliament. Let understand also the most difficult government that they have an opportunity with human rights, because there is no economy, there is no cultural situation, there is no politics that can work without human rights. So every country, before or less, will have, I really believe, a complete possibility of human rights, every country. And the point is to let understand that the people, and particularly the worst governor of some country, and we know, and today we heard a lot of them, to let them understand that they have two possibilities. Or they decide to came in the space of human rights for their choose and in a good way, in a good route to that country, or before or less, they will lose the power because of the absence of freedom and human rights. So I believe we have to let people understand that. We have to do more network, and we have to do exactly what Open Dialogue and all the other civil society associations that we have today, for example, FIDO, for example, Global Magnitsky, Global Committee of Rule of Law, for example, the Radical Party. We have a lot of BPU and many other associations that we are working together. And so I believe we can really win our idea of human rights. And last thing I want to say, if we understand which kind of work we had in these days, in these years, these really few of years, so when we speak together, and first, for the first time, you and Eleonora and Paola and other people told me and speak me and Laura about Magnitsky Act, and we tried to understand how to put that inside the system of law in Italy and in other countries. Was impossible to imagine that today we will have already many countries using some of that sanction in their foreign politics. So I really believe that we can change the situation of human rights with our work and with our network.
Yeah, Roberto, the only one question, since all our previous speakers, they said the biggest problem and challenge that sanctions implemented too late, because actually it should be preventive mechanism when you already, like in Belarus, like in Russia, like in occupied territory of Crimea, like in Kazakhstan, China, you have already problem fixed. I mean fixed because you know that it exists. You know it's massive.
Yes.
So. And you know, this is the biggest problem when it should be. So how
I understand very well. The point is that, first of all, sanction is something that is very useful, not only to use really, but to let people understand. So if we will have many situations in which one we use the sanction, other country will understand that if they are going to do something like that, they will have sanctions. So they can choose not to do that. So it's a kind of prevention, because in some years, I believe, people can understand that if they do some violation of human rights, the sanction will arrive. And so they can stop before. That is one kind of.
But we have Belarus, we have Russia, we have Crimea occupied, and others. Kazakhstan, they, enjoying impunity and doing it year by year. So when? This is the open question, I think.
I believe. And the other question is the one I told you before, and it's exactly, for example, our work in the Council of Europe that you know very well, because I really believe in the strongness of relationship between countries and in the strongness of dialogue. Your organization is called Open Dialogue, and I believe it's a very, very good choice of name for organization, because the point is, I believe in every country, also in the worst one, there are such people that can understand and that can change the situation of human rights. So we have to stress and stress and stress dialogue.
Okay. Thank you so much, Roberto. And now I would like to give the floor to Eleonora from Italian Federation for Human Rights. Eleonora, Vice President of FIDU, our main and favorite partner, and you are also one of those who broadcasting Made in Slavery. So let's discuss from international point of view, an international organization, you work in many countries, the weakness of the EU global human rights sanctions regime. What could be done and what could be improved so it will be not that slow, it will be effective and more transparent? And can you please also briefly describe on China's repression, because it already was said a lot by Josue, but maybe you can give some more insight how it should be adopted, or just some of your observation in case of persecution of Uyghurs, please.
Thank you, Ludmila, for introducing me, and thank you also to all the distinguished speakers we have today. When we talk of cases of human rights abuses in the countries led by authoritarian regimes like Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, and China, we know that behind these cases there is a wide systematic violations of human rights, and that the victims were often human rights defenders, political opponents, lawyers, journalists are left without justice, while the perpetrators of these abuses enjoy impunity. We know that we need an effective instrument to address these abuses, and that Magnitsky sanctions represent a valuable tool which can avoid the impunity of individuals who are holding key roles in the regime and are responsible of the most serious abuses, and in this sense can be also a tool which can facilitate democratic transition. The Magnitsky style legislation is currently being used in several countries. However, as we know, countries implement this legislation in different ways, and its impact obviously depends on how it is designed. The European Union adopted last December the EU Global Human Rights Sanction Regime, as we already said, which seeks to address serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide. Of course, we are happy to have this new legislation. However, according to us, there are still some serious concerns with it. First of all, these sanctions require unanimous agreement among the member states. And this is difficult to achieve and can reduce potential effectiveness, for example, in the listing process. Also, this legislation doesn't mention corruption, and we know well how corruption and human rights abuses are connected together, as ground corruption undermines the rule of law and the stability of governments and countries. Third thing is that NGOs and civil society, and we talk a lot about civil society in this discussion, is not allowed to point the fingers at human rights offenders, as the member states insisted on keeping this power on their hands, together with the EU High Representative. According to us, this should be a tool which empowers individuals and the civil society, as their participation is an added value in the process of uncovering human rights violations and in collecting evidence. In March, member states agreed to impose these sanctions to target officials responsible for Navalny's arrest, sentencing, and persecution. But this list did not mention Russian oligarchs who benefit from his arrest and whose corruption has been exposed by Navalny. The EU imposed also sanctions for the repression of Uyghurs minority in Xinjiang in China. These sanctions on China officials have been followed by other sanctions in the UK, US, and Canada. And this is an important message from these countries to the Chinese government. That's why it's very important to act together. However, the UK, Canada, and the EU did not take action against the top official in Xinjiang, Chen Quanguo, who is targeted by US sanctions. And why I'm stressing this point? Because cross-cooperation among countries is important, also in the listing process, in order to target all the perpetrators of the abuses. In 2016, and this is the focus of my podcast, Chen Quanguo was relocated by the Chinese government from the Tibet region to assume leadership in Xinjiang. And since late 2016, more than 1 million Uyghurs and members of Muslim minorities have disappeared into a vast network of detention camps in the region of Xinjiang. And this is, and many experts agree, a program of cultural genocide led by the Chinese government in the name of combating terrorism and poverty. Inside these camps, detainees are subjected to political indoctrination. They are forced to renounce their religion, language, and subjected to torture. And there are also evidence of organ transplant surgeries on detainees or prisoners and mass sterilization of Uyghur women. The so-called, by the Chinese government, re-education campaign appears to be entering now in a new phase. There is evidence that many Uyghurs are now being forced to work in factories within Xinjiang and in other regions in China. And in my podcast, I've collected the evidence by experts like Adrian Zenz, by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and also the testimony of Gulbar Jalilova, Uyghur citizen of Kazakhstan, who spent 15 months in one of these Chinese concentration camps and was subjected to all these abuses. So again, in uncovering these terrible abuses in Xinjiang, researchers, academics, journalists, NGOs are doing an incredible work. That's why it's important, it's crucial, the involvement of civil society. And if we really want the EU to become a global player in human rights, we should not be afraid to hit all those who are responsible for the systematic violations of human rights, and not just some of them, and hit them where it hurts the most, in their ability to move corrupt money abroad and influence politics of other countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leonora. And now I would like to give the floor to Laura. Laura, are you with us? Please turn on your microphone. Laura Hars, coordinator of the Markup Panel Scientific Council of the Global Committee for Rule of Law. And you actually also work a lot on implementation and adoption of global Magnitsky Law, or so-called global Magnitsky Law, in different countries. Can you please say us something more about inside design of the new global human rights sanctions regime, how they arrived to its adoption, and also actually what are the next steps? So all of us, especially our viewers, because some of them ask, does it possible that, for example, people from village mayors and some law officials would be able to be on these sanctions list? Some people don't understand the level, who should be play in personal sanction, and when. If you can also give some short insights on it.
Well, I'll try. Thank you so much, Ludmila, and thank you especially also to all the testimonies that have come before me. I think it's so valuable for all of us as activists, let's say, the lucky ones in democratic societies. Senator Roberto Rampi is right. No society is perfect, and we have to work on our human rights records everywhere. But I think when we hear from these people inside different realities, it is very clear that there is a very big difference. And for once, Roberto, I'm not fully agreeing with you when you think that dialogue is still possible. I think we have to be aware that at a certain point also the idea that economic prosperity, economic development and cooperation would have led to further or a betterment of human rights for everyone and the rule of law, that we kind of see that that idea is no longer valid, also because we see an increasing cooperation between all these authoritarian regimes, and we see this cooperation also at the level very much of the United Nations, and for example in the United Nations Human Rights Council. And obviously when those institutions that were set up actually as mechanisms to protect and defend and improve human rights everywhere are being blocked and hijacked in a way by a majority of these kind of nations, that actually highlights why we need our own mechanisms. And I think that was the genius of Bill Browder and obviously the late Senator McCain to come up with this mechanism. And I think we need to also insist on calling it Magnitsky, even if the European Union has shied away from doing so. So we need to honor that name and also the people that actually brought us this new instrument. I'm not sure I'm an an expert enough, Ludmila, to answer completely to your question, but how did we arrive here? And I think from how we arrived here, we need also some lessons on where we need to go, on what we as activists need to push for. One of the things was obviously Senator Rampi recalled it. At a certain point, there was a push in I'm talking about the European Union. Obviously, after the US and everything that happened there, they led the way for a lot of us. But so in the European Union, what we saw some national parliaments willing to work on this. You, Roberto, deposited the proposal in Italy, but especially I remember the Netherlands was very much working on it. And it was actually the Netherlands, the government from the Netherlands, that then took that proposal to the European Union, which at a certain point also kind of blocked any further discussion on this in national parliaments, because the idea was if we have a coordinated mechanism at the European Union level, that is obviously better than having one in each jurisdiction or not having one. I think there was an appeal by Bill Browder and other Russian opposition leaders, not others. I remember at a press conference the evening that Alexei Navalny was arrested, and Bill Browder actually made a call, and also the others, to go also back though to adopting national legislation, because obviously one of the big issues we see with the current EU framework is that we need unanimity among all member states to arrive at some sanctions. And this obviously is a very, very big limit. I have to say, in the first place, I was surprised actually that so soon after the adoption, I follow especially China, they actually came up already with sanctions, very limited ones, only for individuals in China. This was a very big step, which I did not expect. But what we've also seen from that is that it only came, I think, through the coordination between the US, UK, Canada, and the EU. So that's another, I think, very important lesson for us in the EU in general, that unfortunately, even if the EU wants to be a big global player and they're talking about all this strategic autonomy, when it actually comes down to acting,
they look on others.
We need the US pressure, we need those others. So I think for civil society also it's very important that we keep this in mind and try to coordinate with civil society actors within those various jurisdictions to come up together and to push for the same names together, because obviously all of us, I think we have tons of names in mind, but to coordinate and make sure that, maybe the same things are being pushed in the different jurisdictions, I think maybe in an effective way of doing that. You asked about what level of actors. I think we all would like to see more higher up level actors, and I think from the US an important lesson, the message that you get from people in the State Department who are actually very open in doing briefings and informing people about the possibilities, is that they aim obviously to implement those sanctions that can actually change the situation on the ground. So they're not looking at punishing older crimes for which other mechanisms should exist or would be there. And so I think also when we look at who we want to punish, obviously we cannot ask probably to have sanctions on a president, but that we should look for those higher ups, and so that we can actually effect change on the ground as a proposal. So one is coordination, the other thing exactly is this looking at what can affect change. And then I just want to come back to some of the things Franek in particular said, but this has come back. So the issue of political will and courage, which I already touched upon, the scale also, and especially the issue of the media attention span. So how to get this actually on the agenda. And there I believe, and this is another very important limit of the European framework, because unfortunately the European Parliament does not have any say even in proposing names. So the proposing of names is officially limited to the European Commission and member states. So that means also for civil society, it's very hard maybe to get those names even in there. Who do you have to know? Who do you have to bring them to? There's no official mechanisms. It's not very clear how we can work this. And unfortunately, the European Parliament doesn't have power in this, but what we have seen is that though it's true that the media attention span may be very short-lived, and so it's sometimes hard to have enough leverage to pressure the people with the power to actually make those decisions, actually the European Parliament does have a longer attention span, and they are frequently and constantly in touch with civil society. I think many of you have much more experience than me in lobbying European Parliament. And so that is another thing I think we need to try and work for, even if they don't officially have the power, to see how they can actually try to pressure the European Commission to include certain names. And I know, for example, organizations such as Hong Kong Watch have been very effective in doing that. So that's another good strategy. The last thing I think is how to tackle the frustration we all have. I think every day each of us wakes up, we see new news, and it's always worse. The speed at which these regimes move, the speed at which they are actually capable of implementing the repression. Obviously, that is not something that we in rule of law countries can follow up to, but that can be very frustrating. At the same time, also, we need to push harder, not only for sanctions, but we need to ask our governments really to be more consistent. And I think two projects for the EU that are really underlining this is, one is the Nord Stream project, Nord Stream 2 project with Russia, or the comprehensive agreement on investment with China, and the way that the EU or certain member states, who I shall not name, but everybody knows, are, yes, just not consistent and quite hypocritical in what they are willing to do. And again, unfortunately, there also, again, they're talking about strategic autonomy, but if it was not for the US, and it pains me to say this because nobody wants to be a puppet of any country, but if it was not for the US to point out these difficulties and these problems, it would be very hard to actually move something within the European Union. So we are seeing really all the traditional issues that are alive within the European Union when it comes to actually promoting their values and promoting their human rights abroad, which is the core business of the European Union and foreign policy. And no other global player has this. No other global player says it so specifically, you know, in its outset, in its founding treaties. But it's not just, it seems not capable of doing that at the moment. So I think we have a very long road ahead. But as everybody said, coming together, talking about this together, and coordinating is a very important step forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And now I would like immediately to switch on David Donat Katin. David Donat Katin is Secretary General Parliamentarians for Global Action. Can you please also a little bit give overview to our viewers? What is the role of your organization? Because you know it's really extremely important to have parliamentarians which think and work globally. Laura and basically all of our speakers said about it. And also, if you can also say for us some kind of correlation between targeted sanctions, persecution in case of serious human rights violation, as well as within humanitarian law, where such crimes can be qualified as international crimes. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lyudmila, and I'm really pleased to be with you today. And very impressed by the contributions made by your colleagues speaking from the ground in relating to the Hong Kong and Chinese situation, and Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine. It's really impressive what you are doing. I also want, if I can, Lyudmila, bring in a little bit of a voice of optimism here, because,
sure. Because we have what we need.
Finally, there is a president of the United States who is saying that universal human rights are the policy for foreign relations. This didn't happen with, I don't know how many presidents. I have to go back to, I don't know who. Maybe it was Jimmy Carter who did it post-Vietnam disaster, but you know. So I think, and we are seeing a number of dots coming together, including what has been happening with the EU. We have seen, for example, finally, an understanding that the main threat to our survival in terms of civilization comes from places like Saudi Arabia. It doesn't come from some sort of, crazy network of terrorists. It's a much more cultural, and we have seen it with the crimes against humanity in Yemen and the decision to stop the selling of weapons to Saudi Arabia that are being used in Yemen, and the dissociation with the senseless use of armed force that brings about crimes against humanity, war crimes, which are the most serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. We are also seeing with the level of attention given by the global community to what's happening in a place called Ethiopia, you know, which had so many dictatorial regimes. The Nobel Peace Committee gave the prize to the prime minister, and now he invaded Tigray and has been probably involved in the killing and the repression of thousands of people who have the right to be opposing him. But that's not what happened. So it is an extremely complex situation, of course. There are a lot of reasons to be worried, but certain elements are changing. Now, PGA is the largest network of individual lawmakers that belong to it in their individual capacity, not on behalf of their country, not on behalf of a political party, not on behalf of their committee. The only requirement is that they come from democratic countries or countries in transition towards democracy. Our biggest campaign, and I'm so happy to be here together with Antonio Stango, probably 30 plus years after we were together on the movement towards the creation of an international criminal court. Our organization since 1989, at that time, we also had notable Italian members like Emma Bonino in the leadership, was the launch of a global campaign for the creation of a permanent international criminal court well before the UN Security Council decided to establish the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda. The genocide didn't take place yet. The disintegration of Yugoslavia didn't take place yet. 1989 is the time in which PGA launched this global campaign. At the time, the leader was A.N.R. Robinson, a gentleman from Trinidad and Tobago, who was also a member of parliament and became prime minister after the Cold War. He tabled the resolution. And here I want to bring, and as of today, we have 1,200 members in 136 countries. Here I want to say that the sanctions are very, very important, but we need to do more to combat impunity. What we need to do, for example, if under the European regime, we can confiscate, we can freeze the assets of certain oligarchs, like big villas in Sardinia or all the property that our colleague was showing us in her video presentation. But then they travel, let's say, to Italy to enjoy their vacation in Sardinia. And there is no national law to implement the Rome Statute and bring them to justice for the crime against humanity of extermination, torture, rape, enforced disappearances of persons, and so on. Then the sanctions are not enough, because impunity means justice for the victims through reparation and measures of putting a closure and then moving forward with democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. So I think we need to do more also in the EU, and this is the missing link. Also, countries like Ukraine, we in PGA strongly support the movement of the Tatars and the freedom fighters in the Donbass. And we have been in the radar for all those years since the Euromaidan revolution. But Ukraine has not yet joined the International Criminal Court. So Ukraine accepted the jurisdiction. The court is ready to start with investigations, yet there has been hesitation. Somebody has said in Kiev, oh, but this is going to be an anti-Russian policy. No, it's not anti-Russian. It's pro-rule of law and human rights. So we need to work together, continue to work together. There is an important law where the FIDH members in Ukraine and other NGOs, including PGA, have been pushing the parliament to adopt it. It's now in the plenary, so hopefully that will align the domestic legal framework with the international law requirements, because countering the illegal acts that are occurring in these occupied territories is not about counter-terrorism. It's about preventing and countering impunity for gross human rights violations and war crimes and crimes against humanity. The next step should be for Ukraine to ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC. Now, what is the main limit of the sanctions? The sanctions, we call them smart and personal or individual, because we don't want to sanction the civilian population like we were doing in the old days against the Saddam Hussein regime. That didn't work. Yet they are not a form of individual punishment. Those individuals are innocent before being proven guilty before a court of law. We are making here assumptions that they are the ones who should be targeted. So we need to give them the right to defend themselves in a proper court of law. Therefore, sanctions in reality are not directed against the individual as such. They are a response to the internationally wrongful act committed by the state, the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, the government of. Then we have an impact on their interests, and we have a leverage. And I totally agree with you. They have to come sooner than later. But we need to be extremely careful, because the two major families of sanctions are asset freezing of assets, which is very fine. I think there is consensus. This is the most effective one. We need to use it more. But then there is the travel bans. And here, Parliamentarians of Global Action wants to bring a very strong voice against the choir. We don't need, for these gross human rights abusers, travel bans. We actually need to invite them to travel more and come to our countries, as a general from Syria decided to do, and found himself guilty of war crimes before a court of justice in Germany 2 months ago, confirmed by the Federal Court of Justice in Karlsruhe. So on the basis of universal jurisdiction, we can try and bring them to justice and end their impunity. So in other words, the travel ban needs to be used very smartly. In addition, when President Trump, in the face of the horrible things ongoing in Hong Kong and other situations, wanted to sanction, including some of my students at NYU, some Chinese students studying in the United States, I think, and this was also in the face of the rhetorics against the so-called China virus, no, the coronavirus. I think that was counterproductive, because these young people studying law, global affairs, international economics, they believe in transnational cooperation. They can tell you, you know what, we don't really like the Chinese government, but we cannot say it, because even when we send messages on our mobile phones, they are intercepting us, even if we are studying in Europe or in Canada or elsewhere. So, but let us be here. Let us learn human rights law. And let me finish here about the importance of the work that we should do on the basis of international law. Let's take the example of Hong Kong. The situation in Hong Kong is not outside the framework of the applicability of international law, because until 2047, Hong Kong, under international law, is bound by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Sino-British Declaration, it's an international treaty, and on the 13th of March, the UK Foreign Office declared it has been breached under international law. Therefore, now every state in the world can take measure to support the Hong Kongers who are fighting for democracy, human rights. And the minimum they had, they didn't have really the ideal situation, but they had these two systems, one state solution, at least until 2047. Then it becomes fully within the realm of Chinese sovereignty. So there are already some tools that can be used in the traditional international framework. And there are small states, take the Gambia, they are making use of them, because the Gambia brought a case under the Genocide Convention against the Myanmar regime, which at that time included another Nobel Peace Prize laureate who was defending the generals for the alleged genocide against the Rohingya population. The paradox of history, now she is a victim of the same crimes that she was defending, being committed by the same people who are now victimizing her. But this shows us that also small states, not only the big powers, can do something. So the goal of PGA would be to use our global presence to bring the African voices, the Latin American voices. We have a memorandum of cooperation with the Organization of American States on promotion of democracy, as well as where we are strong in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where there is democracy, not everywhere. And then create a system through which we see the sanctions as part of the broader toolbox for accountability and the fight against impunity.
Thank you so much, David. I would like to give the floor, since we are absolutely out of time, I would like to give the floor immediately to Paola Gaffarini, and maybe afterwards, if you have any other conclusions, we can add it at the very end. So, Paola, floor is yours.
Yes. Hello, hello everyone, and thanks to all our guests for your contributions. So, I would just like to briefly explain an example of a report that we have published recently, just last year, which represents an example of how civil society can substantially support democratic governments with designating human rights abusers. So, as I said, last October, we published a report under the title Servants of the Regime, which lists 364 human rights violators who are responsible for or are involved in a systematic pattern of human rights abuses in Kazakhstan. So it was conceived for two main reasons. From one side, as a response to the atmosphere of impunity in the country, and from the other side, as a response to the growing demand of civil society to hold accountable those perpetrators who committed serious human rights violations. So the report, just to give you a brief presentation of how we collected information, is based on evidence from 1,119 victims of political persecution in from 37 cities in Kazakhstan. It is also based on documents, administrative and criminal cases, photo and video materials. We've also made large use of social media networks that we use to establish, for example, kinship relationships of the perpetrators and other data. But we have also collected information through a popular Facebook group, which is called Activists Not Extremists, which is made of thousands of members, including human rights defenders and human rights NGOs on the ground. And we managed even to collect information from friends and relatives of the perpetrators. So they didn't want to be complicit of this crime, so they anonymously gave information to Open Dialogue. So we then organized this information. We managed to collect in a dedicated Instagram profile, and as well as on an ad hoc Telegram chatbot, and then compiled in the report. So this dossier serves as a submission on behalf of civil society to the US government under the Global Magnitsky Act, as well as under the UK Global Human Rights Sanctions regulation. But it can also be extended to Canada, for example, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and it may be served in the future to those countries which are developing similar legislation, like Australia, Italy, Germany, and Norway. And I would just like to conclude with a brief presentation regarding different models of cooperation with civil society and those countries which have enforced Magnitsky-type sanctions. So I would start with the US model, which is so far the most virtuous example in this sense, because it establishes regular consultations between the State Department and those NGOs willing to present their submissions. Although the Treasury and the State Department are not obliged to implement the request put forward by NGOs, the US government has to consider the material they receive from civil society. And similarly, in the UK, the FCO has committed to take into consideration submissions presented by any person or organization. However, it is not obliged to provide comments or feedback on the material received. But at the same time, civil society can actually keep track of the ultimate feedback, because all designations are made public by default. So similarly, the Canadian government welcomes proposals of designations from human rights organizations, particularly within the framework of the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Official Act and the Special Economic Measures Act. Moreover, the UK, the US, and Canada have established and continue to enhance a practice of sharing information received by civil society organizations. So they share information across different jurisdictions. And although the EU hasn't put in place such a mechanism, such a dedicated mechanism to share information with like-minded countries, first steps have been undertaken at the beginning of March, when the EU, in coordination with the US, designated the first Russian officials who were involved in Navalny's case. However, as Eleonora pointed out before in her previous intervention, the EU new global human rights sanction regime failed to provide an EU-level advisory committee, as it was basically recommended by the EP, which strongly wanted the participation of civil society. So just to conclude, looking at the proposals of sanctions regime which are being discussed in Europe, I think that it is of absolute importance that all states, particularly EU member states or members of the Council of Europe, foresee the participation of civil society in identifying, in designating and sanctioning human rights abusers. So, for example, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe made a recommendation to its member states advising to adopt a record-keeping system with all witness statements, all documents, human rights reports, specifically on the country where the officials should be targeted. So I think that it's, and it's also what it emerged from this discussion, that it's only with the cooperation between victims of human rights violations, human rights defenders, lawmakers and governments that we can really fight impunity in a concerted way in those authoritarian countries where, unfortunately, justice cannot be achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you to everyone who is, I will just now add those who we have currently in the room, just to have some overview. I'm not able to add everyone, of course, since of limitation of application, but I would like to thank everyone for participation and say that we receive a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. But I think we should keep our discussion and organize next round of such round table, including civil society from different countries. So we can, actually I see also Laura, so we can find out the way how to be effective to speed up process and find accountable those who are responsible for human rights violation. Dialogue is important, no doubt, but bringing to justice and the stop feeling of impunity is also important if we want to stop human rights violation. I'm really, really grateful for all partners and all the testimonies of key speakers that we have today. And I hope that our viewers also will send questions. So next round of our discussion, we will invite new testimony and witnesses and different other countries. Thank you so much to everyone, and I'm closing our debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.